Recording in progress.
Good evening. Tonight is the Chicago Computer Society's Linux SIG meeting for the month of February 2026. How time is already flying. We're almost through a sixth of the year already. One little note that I want to mention so I don't forget it. If you're keeping up to date on your browsers, and you should be checking at least once a week the way things have been going for the last several months, you should keep your browsers up to date. Firefox current version includes AI. Now, if you go into settings of Firefox, you'll see a new item on the left column. It talks about AI. On mine, on Linux, Mint, and on my Windows systems, they all came turned off. And I think for most people, that's exactly what they want, is it turned off. So you don't have to opt out. You have to opt in if you want AI on Firefox. But I want to add one other thing that's in the handout, and it'll be briefly talked about in the presentation. Notepad recently had in a security issue. Notepad traditionally is a very simple text editor, just like we use in Linux. But then Microsoft added AI to it, Copilot. And that's the source of the possible problem. It didn't materialize into a real crisis. It was caught early enough, and they put out a patch that tries to prevent that being exploited. But that's how bad things can get with AI when you really, AI developers don't know how some of this AI works at all, let alone can control it. And so the end result is, if you're like Microsoft, that was pushing AI into every nook and cranny they could find in Microsoft's operating system and applications, including Microsoft 365, it becomes a potential avenue for malicious intent to take control and inject code into your application that can be executed to be a starting point of becoming infected and possibly have your computer taken over by the bad guys. So these two things happen to dovetail. Microsoft finally, in the month of February here, has said, Uncle, we've heard about the problems with AI being rejected by the public in general. Even a lot of businesses are not using it, or they're using it in a very restricted way, maybe in just certain departments of their business. And that's a factor. If we're going to use AI, we want control of what it does and when it does it, because we activate it. I use AI in that mode. I don't want agentic AI. And there is been a big backlash to a lot of these new versions of browsers incorporating AI. They don't look like the normal browser we're used to. Instead, you're talking to an AI to do any of your browsing. It goes out and finds stuff, etc., etc. Well, some people have looked at and experimented with those, and most of them said no thank you and went back to regular versions of the browsers. And that's an important factor. And I think and I hope, based upon supposed statements of Microsoft, they are going to be addressing the problems they have had for the last several months with bugs in their code for updates. They are so far holding true with both the February update. There are fewer problems being reported with the February regular update. And I've also installed the preview version, which came out in the last several days. And so far, that's helping out quite a bit. But they're also talking about removing a lot of the AI that they've been injecting into applications a lot and reducing, shall we say, the intrusion of the AI or giving you a switch. Notepad as an example. If you go into the settings of Notepad, you have the ability to turn Copilot off. And so the icon doesn't even show up. And it's not supposed to be running in the background without your knowledge. So we'll have to all wait and see. Presently, I'm going to open up the floor to anybody with questions, comments, news that maybe I haven't even heard of. So anybody got anything? Gee, we got a lot of deadheads. Like I said, we got a lot of deadheads. Go ahead, Dennis.
I want to make sure that I'm not misunderstanding this thing. You're talking about, updating browsers and that. So on my Linux box, whenever I go down to the shield that says, you have, some updates waiting, and I do that, is it updating like my Firefox browser and that, or I have to do that like on a totally separate thing?
It depends upon your browsers. The majority of the browsers most people are using, yes, they are automatically updated. They'll
Okay.
either be the Debian install native version or they'll be a flat pack. However, there are some browsers that aren't, shall we say, mainstream, at least not yet. I'm experimenting with the Zen browser, which works on Windows as well as on Linux. That's not mainstream. That one, when I went in, instead of seeing the regular browser display, it showed me a screen that says there's an update. And basically, they're not getting off the screen until you do the update. So I did the update, it went through, it installed, and gave me the regular browser screen. So it wasn't draconian. There are some situations where what you had to do was go into your settings for the browser, and you go down near the bottom where you find about the browser, and you bring that up, and it would check then to see if there was a new version of a browser, and then if it found one, it installed it, and you were up to date. If it didn't find one, you were already up to date at that time. So it depends. If you're using the mainstream major browsers, they're pretty much all automated because they are recognized as mainstream. The challengers that are newer browsers, many of them end up having to be some kind of a manual update. Either you're notified when you launch it, or you got to go periodically to the About section in the settings and see if there's a new update. And this includes any browsers based upon Chromium. There's a lot of little browsers that were made by custom for a individual company, such as Avast had one, and another one was CCleaner had one that I know of. Those were not mainstream. So therefore, if you launched them, you had the responsibility of going into settings, About, and seeing if there was a new update. If you didn't do that, eventually you get very outdated. The more outdated you get, the more vulnerable you become. And you got to remember, a browser is your gateway to the internet, and that's where most of the infections come from. And that includes email. Email is not necessarily in the browser, but it may be. It can be in a client, but in either case, it comes through the internet. So you have to take that into account. The browser these days is very different from the browsers 10 years ago, and very different from those 20 years ago or older than that. And there are many more threats and vulnerabilities galore, and it's getting worse, not better. And part of this is the criminal-minded people who create all this headache are getting the use of AI, and they know how to craft their malware accordingly to try and be even more stealthy, really, in getting into people's system. That includes, like in emails, how to craft various emails for phishing and vishing, etc., that don't have spelling errors and some other various obvious red flags. But it also means, like on YouTube, there is a ton of content out there that is AI generated. Some of it is actually being used properly to do good things in conveying information all of us need about things going on in the internet that we need to watch for, make changes or improvements in what we're doing. But at the same time, too, lots of them are disinformation, and they give you a false sense of what's going on about something. And it's not always about computer technology. They're using computer technology for political purposes, or to badmouth one operating system versus another. Windows Basic is a good operating system. Mac OS is a good operating system. Linux, I have maybe a few reservations, but the vast majority of Linux are very good distros, and they're kept up to date. And as long as you keep your system up to date and all the programs you install up to date, you minimize your danger of malware threats, except when you get one of these AI generated things. They might get you to try and do something. What you have to do, you have to have a AI client you reasonably trust, you have to give it a statement. You want to analyze the following video and look for these things. I mentioned it in a previous meeting. I have crafted one that does a pretty good job. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it catches a lot of stuff that I might, so to speak, tune out if I'm because I listen to the videos before I post them and use them elsewhere, and sometimes I miss some things other people hear that I don't hear, and that can cause some problems. So, and I've got some that I really have to watch because if you're a person who is bothered by, shall we say, foul language, this person's vocabulary seldom goes through a whole video without at least one iteration, but usually a lot more. And I can tolerate it because my mind just tunes it out. But at the same time, too, I'm not about to take his videos, even if it's got good information in it, and post it out there for others to view because it's something that might upset a number of people. And if it's got politics, religion, race, etc., clickbaiting hype, etc., I try and filter that out as much as possible. So that's what you got to do these days. More and more, I've got usually doing this under Windows. Uh, I have a tab sit there, and I just have to put in the URL of a video, and it'll give me all the feedback. And it does a pretty good job letting me know whether I've got a video that is garbage or at least should not be directly posted. You might be able to paraphrase some of what's being said textually, but I'm not going to take any of these videos that are created by somebody else and do editing on them, even though I could. It would violate copyright. And so that's illegal. To use a college term, you're plagiarizing. So I have to take some videos that I gained something from, and sometimes I have to just delete them, or I keep them for my own personal information. Anybody got anything else? Well, since you're all so talkative, I want to go into this one here. Last month I didn't do, whoops, that was smart. Come on. What in the heck is going on? Screen sharing is paused. What? This thing is halfway between the moon and Mars. Hang on a minute. I'm going to try this one more time. I have a bad suspicion. I'm on the X11 login, and X11 is changing a lot, so is Wayland, and it's getting to be a genuine headache. Well, well, well. What do we got? Oh, spotted it. Okay, hang loose. Now, all right. Now, we're going to. What happened was something changed what window I was in. So I wasn't on desktop. I was on desktop 3, I think. How I got there, I don't know. I don't care right now. Probably the mouse moved in the right spot and accidentally got clicked. All right, let's see if I can figure out how to do what I want to do. I'm going to go to desktop, share, and I'm going here. And let's see if I can shrink that a little bit. Mostly to give me an edge. All right, now, and I'm bringing up Software Manager. Now, what I was doing for a number of months is a lot of pieces of software that a lot of us don't know about because we don't go through all of what's in Software Manager. It's only over 30,000 different possibilities, a little too much. But I got a hold of a bunch of different ones, and I took, it's not the one I want. Okay, now what I have here is a list of them. We're going to go to this one here first. What the heck? Oh, wrong keyboard. Playing with 4 different computers, it can be tricky. Sysmon task, no attachment, but it's a FOSS program. So I'm going to come up here to the regular tab, put in sysmon task, and it's a project out on GitHub, and a lot of developers that have been on GitHub are starting to leave in droves because of the intrusiveness of Microsoft with its Copilot. It's generally a application. It says Ubuntu and its family. Well, sorry, but it works on Mint as well, the regular Mint. It may or may not work on LMDE. I didn't have time to mess around with trying it out there. But it gives you alternatives if you don't want to add the PPA package, then download the binaries from the release and install DoubleClick. So you can deal with this the way you want to. It works under Arch, Fedora, etc. So it's a pretty universal Linux program. And I'm going to back out of that one because this one gives you more information about the application itself. It's a Windows Task Manager lookalike. It only works on X11 login. And this gives you a general idea, and it only covers processes and performance looks. So it doesn't give all the other characteristics of Task Manager under Windows, but at least it gives you some of the same kind of look and feel, especially if you're very familiar with Windows, and most of us are. So it's a case where it looks good, it works good, as long as you are in X11. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this share for the moment. I'm going to minimize that screen. I'll minimize that. And bring that up. And now I'll try and see if I can share again. And whoops, I got the browser. Here we go. Wait a minute. You can't see that. So clicked on the wrong thing. I gotta try and do this again. But I gotta get control of my screen, stop sharing, get off of there, share again, and okay, got the wrong one. Here's the right one. Oop. All right, and let's see if I can enlarge this a bit. So this gives you the CPU. It doesn't give the GPU if you got one. Memory, NVMe or SATA drive for storage, and your internet, whether it's Wi-Fi or Ethernet. This one's right now doing both, but it's only, that's why you see a double graph here. My machine is wired up for Ethernet, but it doesn't seem to want to turn off the Wi-Fi, so I get a combination of both of them, and they don't kill each other. They seem to complement one another. And then if I come over here, I got the processes, and I can take and click on any of the categories at the top of the columns to put things in the order of CPUs. In this case, CPU, I think 1 and 2 are showing. Then there's memory, and then there's reading and writing to disk as separate items, who the owner is of each thing that's running, and what command is doing it. So it gives you a tool, but if you are using Wayland, which is getting to be more useful just about every day, this doesn't work. It won't even launch. So I'm letting you know that up front. Whether the person who created this will make a modification to work under Wayland, I don't know. But I thought I'd toss it in and let you see what it was like. So another one we can try and look at is Photo XX, Photo MA, and Photo CX. And the CX is by a URL, so I'd have to bring in the browser for that one, but FOTO, I'm going to leave it there. As you see, there's XX, show photo, and color wall, but besides the XX version here, these are for editing photos. And this originates with Bob Premick mentioning photo as another editor that some people might want to look at. But there's also MA, yeah, that one didn't have it in here. So if I bring up the browser again, I can come in here, go photo, if I can type. Oops, dummy, did a typo. All right. And the MA stands for Photo Mac. So Photo Mac is another one.
And we're only seeing your view of Sysmontisk.
Okay. It's good old sharing again. It does what it wants to do when it wants to do it. It doesn't care about what the presenter wants. All right. And now that one is foreign language. Let's see if we can get here. Photomac. Photomac was founded by a Turkish media conglomerate, and the newspaper was merged with another newspaper owned by Belgium, I think, is what they were trying to say, unless that's the person's name, and renamed to pass Photomac before being sold. And they don't show there what it looks like, but it's let's see what we got here. Here's one with Max, M-A-X instead of Mac, and it gets into, looks like some Asian type stuff as well. So it's a photo editing type program. Very slow to come in, so I'm not sure where it's located at, but I see a lot of like Chinese characters. So this one may be owned by a Chinese company, whether that's communist China or Taiwan, I don't know. And I'm not going to guess as to which it is. Now, the other one that is in my list is CX. So I'm going to see if I can find that one. I had a URL, but I'll just look it up. This is a Linux version. And so you have Photo CX, but it's not in Software Manager as I recall. Let me see if I can find it in there, because I do have in my personal list. Yeah, CX is not in Software Manager. You have to go to the actual site to get it and download it, and it's made for Linux. So these are 3 different versions, varying capabilities, but along the same general concept of a photo editor. So maybe some of you are interested in that. I'm not a big photo type person, so I'm not that interested in it except for once in a blue moon. Now, another one that came up with Drew King was R clone. And R clone is for command line to be able to sync program files from one computer to a cloud computer where you have storage, as an example, OneDrive, Google Drive, etc., etc. But it can also be pointed to a internal to your network, like a NAS drive. So it has that capability. The bad
Tim,
part.
Tim, I'm still seeing the Photo CX screen.
Oh, okay. thank you. Well, this thing has really got a mind of its own tonight. If that thing doesn't stop doing what it's doing, I'm going to shoot the darn thing. All right. Let's see if I can get this thing to do what I want. Okay, there. That's our clone. And offhand, it's a command line tool. Well, command line tools can be a little migraine headache for a lot of people, and some won't touch it because they think they got to memorize everything. That's not true. Heck, I don't even memorize everything that I do in command line, and I use command line in Windows. I did it on Mac, and I do it in Linux, but I don't try and memorize the commands all the time. If I get stumped on one of them, there are online and offline sources of information about the command and all the options. You have the man pages in Linux that are part of your system that can be brought up. You read up as to what you're trying to do, get the right parameters, but that still seems to be too much for a lot of people. So our clone by itself is of limited use. So somebody created our clone browser, graphical user interface, to create the necessary parameters to run our clone. So when you have the browser, you also have our clone, and this gives you the ability to be able to do synchronization. And one of the big things besides needing to do backups, and full image backups is the best for major disasters. You have time shift that can do a snapshot, which is a abbreviated update, so that if something goes wrong with something you're trying out, you can restore that snapshot and probably be back in business much quicker than using your full image backup. But a time shift snapshot is uncompressed, so it takes up a lot of storage space. With a normal full image backup program, I happen to use Macron Reflect Rescue Media to do it. It is compressed to some degree. The degree can be changed, but the higher the compression rate, the longer the backup takes and the longer a restore of that highly compressed image will take. So that's a factor that you have to keep in mind. Now, the third possibility, and this in particular has to do with your data. A lot of people use what's called the Easter egg, especially the newest people to Linux are using the Easter egg. What's an Easter egg? Basically, it's like having a Windows or a Mac setup where you have one large drive in Windows called C. And in Linux, it has one partition that contains all the folders for root, home, and other partitions, other folders, excuse me. So you, if you have a bad update and you don't have a snapshot to go back to, and you your full image backup is very old, that's a headache, because you're going to end up having to rebuild the whole image and lose your content of your home folder and other folders that might normally be broken out. I'm a believer, and I try and get all of you guys to go along with it. We do partitioning. So we have a root partition. However, we break out the home partition. And that saved me big headaches many times when something went wrong and the snapshot did not handle the problem adequately. So I had to rebuild the root partition and said, oh, by the way, I have a separate partition with the home partition. I want to keep it as is. Don't touch it. But it knows when it rebuilds the root, here's the home partition, and anything that's in it is now active. If you are on Ubuntu, snap packages are the default. They're in the home partition. And anybody who uses snaps on other distributions that normally use Flatpaks, which is doable, they're still in the home partition. Flatpaks are in the /var. If you only got maybe 4 or 5 Flatpaks installed on your system, you're not doing a whole lot with your system. I've got some that exceed 20 already. So bottom line is, I break out also the var partition if I want to do a virtual machine on my Linux system. That is natively stored in the var folder, now a separate partition. Now, why do I want to touch upon the snap pack and the flat pack? It's because they are in separate partitions. They, if you know what you're doing, are protected. You don't have to worry if the root partition gets corrupted of losing any of those things that are in those separate partitions. However, there are additional partitions besides the root that are in some cases being broken out. Many Linuxes are starting to create a UEFI partition if it recognizes the machine has the ability to recognize secure boot, and will make it usually a GPT partition. However, if you're reusing a disk, whether it's a solid state or a spinning hard drive, doesn't matter. Probably was set up as MBR. You have to create a new partition table to the GPT partition. Otherwise, the secure boot doesn't work. Also, a few Linux distros, in addition, want to break out the boot folder. And both of them are very small partitions. A 500 megabyte UEFI partition is way overkill, but at the same time, some of them will not go below 300. And usually if they are left to their own devices, will set up 500. Maybe they know something coming down the pike in the future where they need more space. Boot partition usually is no bigger than 1 gig, and this is to allow the possibility of having a copy of the kernel in the boot partition. And I've never yet understood totally why in some cases that's a good thing versus just leaving the kernel in the rest of the root partition. But I'm sure there's a good reason for it. I haven't come across what that happens to be, and I don't think of it often enough to go looking up additional information on that. So if you crash the system, You have to rebuild the UEFI, which frequently is the biggest cause of your crash. Uh, Possibly the boot partition and the root partition, and you have to tell it any other folders that have separate partitions and say keep the content. Do not format those partitions, and it'll dutifully do it. The only other partition that you may have that you don't have to do anything about is a swap partition. It'll figure that out all by itself. Some people don't use a swap partition. They rely upon a swap file that's in the root. And from everything I've seen and heard so far, it's just slightly slower than a separate partition. But the big factor is how big of a swap partition should you have? And that varies quite a bit. If you have under 8 gigs, you should have 2 to 4 gigabyte swap partition. When you start going above 8 gigs, there are people who may have 12, 16, 24, 32 gigs, maybe even more than 32 gigs on their system. And the old adage way back used to be have the swap partition as big as twice the amount of physical memory. That's overkill. I would say, especially at anything above 16 gigs, you may start cutting down to 0 a swap partition. But there's another couple factors that I have touched upon a little bit in the past, and eventually we'll revisit them again. One of them is Z-swap. The other one is Z-RAM. If you have 8 gigs or less of memory, it's best to set up a Z-RAM, and it's due to its speed efficiency. And if you've got more than 8 gigs, it's best to use Z-swap. The two are creating a compressed partition-like within memory. In other words, it's taking and using up a section of your memory, real RAM memory, not virtual memory, and creating a single folder that is compressed, and it acts as a first choice that when you need more RAM to load in extra modules or new programs that you want to launch, instead of it going out to your storage drive, whatever you have, even an NVMe 4th or 5th generation, it's not as fast as your physical RAM memory. So what happens is Z-swap and Z-RAM intercept what it wants to store, puts it in the compressed memory, and reduces your I/O to your storage devices. Very important, either in latency, time, and or if it's a solid state storage device, you are adding I/O operations, which there's a limit on all SD devices as to how many read writes you can do. So they buffer swapping first to memory, then if push comes to shove, they'll push it out to your storage device. So depending on what you're doing on your system, it can be advantageous to have these available. If you got 4 gigs or 2 gigs of memory, you definitely want the ZRAM set up. I know I have one system that's exactly in that boat. It was a nightmare to run until I at least got the ZRAM up and going. It's only, I think, 256 megabytes in size, which doesn't sound like much, but if you got 4 gigs of memory, minus a chunk that's for your video and a 256 for your ZRAM, now you're down to roughly 3 gigs of RAM available, and your operating system, even with Linux, some versions of Linux will take up to 2 gigabytes, maybe slightly over that, which doesn't leave you a lot of free RAM for your other applications. Some versions only have a footprint as low as 1.1, and I've had heard that there's a couple of versions of low-end old hardware Linux that may be as low as 256 megabytes. I don't know if there's any that go lower than that. And that leaves you quite a bit of space. But browsers are going to be one of your biggest headaches, because the browsers take up so much space, and it's very critical the amount of tabs you have open at any one time, because that adds even more RAM requirements. So you have, it also is a source of crashing your system because they take up so much space. So you have to really examine when you're 4 gigabytes or smaller memory footprint, even with Linux, your choice of browser is very, very important. So I bring that up. Now, one other thing, get this stupid Solidon open up a little bit. There's another one, but it's not, again, in a software manager. And basically what it is, come on, is our clone shuttle. And I came across it, but I never got around to really examining what it is. It's an alternative. It's another front end. It's similar to the shuttle browser, but it's called our clone shuttle. It gives you, again, more of a graphical interface to help you do our cloning of file syncing to other storage media that may be on-site or off-site. So that's another tool to be aware of. So there's 2 graphical interfaces to be able to use the R clone, and this is one of those things where, especially if you're using the Easter egg concept of one partition, you need to really look at both time shift, using the snapshot feature to an external drive, or using such as rclone browser and rclone shuttle to copy at least your data files off onto another drive locally in your house on a different drive that's external, or a different computer in your home, or you want to go to the cloud. It doesn't matter which. That way, if you are on the Easter egg and you got to rebuild the whole Easter egg, yeah, you got to remember all your programs, put all the programs back, but your data is saved elsewhere, and you can just restore it through the rclone shuttle and browser, and you're back in business. How long it's going to take you? A lot depends upon the speed of your network in your home and or the internet connection you have if you're using an offsite cloud storage. So that's a factor that you have to take into account. If you're using the Easter egg, you also have to take the time to remember every program that you put on your computer that you use, where you got it, reinstall it, do any customization required, which hopefully you remember what that was. But most people will not create a written journal of how they modify their system. That creates a big headache. Having a separate home partition, a separate var partition that are left alone in a rebuild process gives you most of that information back, but it's not 100% because you will have programs that you installed that are native packages that have to be reinstalled by you. So you have to know what native packages you installed on your computer. All the flat packs, snap packs will be in the other two partitions, home and var, and you don't have to reinstall any of those. They're there, they work, that's it. So you got to understand some of the things that you have to do are geeky, yes. But if you're not trying to tackle setting up Linux by yourself and you are using, say, a user group like this is, you get guidance, you can set up a good system that is recoverable with a minimum of real effort on your part. And this doesn't include using a full image backup to get you back to square one. But your data may be out of date. If you have the rclone shuttle, rclone browser installed, that can give you a way of getting your data all back from whatever source you recorded it on. Again, rclone does not do any compression, just like Timeshift. So if you're looking for a way of having compression, the only thing I can recommend, especially if you're storing on a local drive that you plug into a USB port or a Thunderbird port, or it's another machine that you have that you are backing up to, make a folder as the target and designate it as a compressed folder. This would then, as you are saving stuff through the rclone browser or shuttle, that data gets compressed. When you move it back, it goes into a folder that is uncompressed. And that's all there is to it. Anybody got any questions at this point? At times I wonder if anybody's in this meeting besides me. At any rate, Warpinator. That's another one. That's in the software manager, and Warpinator is had some recent updates. It's good. Hope I got it right. Yeah, here we go. And shares files on your network and local network. So you have, it looks like two versions here, and they're almost rated the same. And it's another tool that can be used, say, in place of our clone, browser or shuttle, if you're backing up to a local machine or attached a drive. So that's worth looking at. And let's see. There's another one. Okay. There's another one. Called Warp. And it's a fast and secure file transfer. And it's something that might give you improved speed even on slower devices. It's not a miracle worker. It's going to be restricted to limits of your storage devices that are the source and the target. So you have a real application here. Warp allows you to securely send files to each other via the internet or local network by exchanging a word-based code. Best transfer method will be determined using the magic wormhole protocol, which I never heard of before, which includes local transfers if possible. So this gives you some idea. It sends files. Every file transferred is encrypted. Directly transfer files on the local network if possible. And the internet connection is required. QR code support. Compatibility with the magic wormhole command, which I never heard of before. So it gives you some real capabilities. The part that I liked the most, many of these, like our clone using and our sync, do not encrypt your data. So if you're sending it up to the cloud account, you may be sending up raw information. You have to check that out yourself. Warp here would transfer it encrypted. And that's one advantage I can see. Warpinator, I don't know if it had the ability to let's see here. No, Warpinator, fully secure, does encryption also. So there's two tools that will give you transfer capabilities and encrypt the information, especially if you are using cloud storage accounts. And that's quite important. So keep these little tools in mind. And I think I got one more. Yeah. Let's see. The last one here. GrayJ. Universal Media Aggregator. How many of you will need this? I don't know. But GrayJ is a multi-platform media application that allows you to watch content through the multiple platforms in a single application. GrayJ enables you to create and watch video content in your own terms by allowing you to follow creators, not platforms, giving you the full ownership and control over what you watch, etc. So that sounds interesting if you got a good use for it. The one thing that comes to mind would be sports bettors. Sports bettors don't go usually betting on one game. They're doing multiple games. They would probably love something like this. Okay. Any questions so far? Well, you guys are really talkative. Gotta find the other file. And okay, we'll see what we can get through. Close that up too. All right. Now, oops, you're gonna start on me. Someone, hang loose. I don't want you to start. Not yet. Shoot. Because I forgot one setting. Otherwise, you're gonna have to be lip readers. There it is. Got it. Okay.
Get modern Adobe Photoshop installing on Linux with some new Wine patches. Plus, MX Linux 25.1 is out with multi-init support, and CachyOS dropped a new ISO with fresh kernels and desktop updates. Also, Zorin OS 18 just hit a big milestone with over 2 million downloads, and there's a new convergence phone project called NextPhone that claims that it can run Android, Linux, and even Windows. All of this and more on This Week in Linux, the weekly news show that keeps you up to date with what's going on in the Linux and open source world. Now let's jump right into your source for Linux Good News. This episode of Twill is sponsored by Sandfly Security. More on them later. So this is one of those stories that sounds fake at first, but it's real. A community developer has figured out how to get modern versions of Adobe Photoshop to install and run on Linux using Wine. And this includes Photoshop 2021 and Photoshop 2025. Now, people have been able to get Photoshop to run on Linux in the past, but typically this is very old versions because the Creative Cloud installer has been a major roadblock for years. But this week, that part has been solved. The patches target specific Windows components that Adobe relies on, like MS HTML and MS XML, which handle the installer's HTML, JavaScript, and XML configuration files. Wine historically struggled with those pieces, so the installer would just break. The developer tweaked Wine to better mimic older Internet Explorer behavior and fixed how XML data and IDs are handled. And that was enough to make the Creative Cloud installer complete successfully. Once installed, the developer claims that Photoshop 2021 runs smoothly, though there are still some quirks, and reports on Photoshop 2025 are mixed. This is all unofficial, requires compiling a patched version of Wine from source, and of course there's no native Linux build from Adobe, so mileage may vary, but the patches have been submitted upstream to Wine, and they're not been merged yet, but there's still some, there's a lot of effort and a lot of interest, so we'll see what happens there. The Creative Cloud installer working at all is a big deal, and it opens the door for other Adobe apps to potentially run on Linux in the future. In fact, there's also a report by the same developer that he was able to get Adobe Collections to load as well. Now, again, this is for power users and experimenters, so it's not going to be an average user's or a beginner user's path to get Adobe Photoshop to work on Linux, but this is a very promising development when it comes to one of the biggest creative blocks for people switching to Linux, because let's face it, a lot of people use Photoshop. In fact, I used to use Photoshop for years when I did website design, graphic design, and all that sort of stuff. And even when I switched to Linux, I kept a virtual machine of Windows exclusively to run Photoshop. But I've been happily, and I mean happily, using something else for years now. And that something else is Photopea. Photopea.com. And for me, it's at least 90% as good. Now, it's not going to have absolutely everything that Photoshop has, because Photoshop continues to develop, and Photopea is a much smaller team. So understandably, it doesn't have everything, but it is so good for what it is. And the price is completely reasonable. It's like $50, something like that per year. I don't remember exactly the details, but it is ridiculously good price. And it also does all the fundamental features that I want from Photoshop, like smart objects, smart filters, masking, all that sort of stuff. Like the layer systems are like, not of course layer system, but I mean like layer styles. And there's a ton of things that Photopea can do that is Photoshop is known for. So it's a fantastic thing. And anybody who is interested in switching to Linux and is worried about Photoshop being supported, check out Photopea. I think there's a huge likelihood that you'll be able to switch over with Photopea. And by the way, they also have a vector system called VectorP. So for those who are Illustrator users. Anyway, so it's had the fundamental features that I've needed from Photoshop. So I haven't even considered Photoshop for long enough that I don't remember the last time I used it. However, a lot of people are still stuck in the Adobe Vortex. So this is great news that chips away at one of the biggest blockers, keeping creative professionals off of the Linux desktop. So if you must use Photoshop because the company you work for requires you to, then this would be really good news for you. But if you don't have that requirement, check out Photopea. It's really good. And very well done to the developer who did this work of Files Basement. I think that's how it is. Really cool work to see, because Photoshop is one of the biggest blockers for creative professionals, and it's awesome to see that it's maybe not going to be a blocker anymore. 2 months ago in November, MX Linux released version 25. This was a big update to the distro as they upgraded the base from Debian 12 to Debian 13. Now, we didn't cover it on Twill at the time because, well, I was hit by a car, but this limited my video output quite a bit, and I'm back now on Twill making weekly episodes, so let's cover MX Linux, especially since 25.1 came out this week. MX Linux has a new point release with MX Linux 25.1, and it's a pretty interesting one because it leans into flexibility more than most mainstream distros. Now, this release is based on Debian 13.3 Trixie and ships with the Linux 6.18 LTS kernel. Now, by default, MX Linux uses sysv and it, but they also have an interesting approach of supporting multiple init systems out of the box. So you can also use systemd. Now, this feature was actually removed from the previous release with MX25 due to technical issues. And also they announced this back in August of last year because there were some technical issues making it not possible to have both of the init systems running on the same ISO, so they had different ISOs based on the init system. But with this point release, they've brought it back. The project calls this the init diversity, and they've improved tooling to make switching and managing these init systems even smoother. Now, that is not going to matter to most users, but while being a niche feature, it matters to some people who want to avoid systemd or just want to experiment with various init systems. So this is a really interesting approach to Linux distro building. On the desktop side, MX Linux 25.1 includes updated versions of XFCE, KDE Plasma, and Fluxbox. Along with installer improvements, there have also been updated drivers, better hardware support, and tweaks for performance and stability that they inherited from Debian 13. Now, it's not the flashiest of releases, but reinforces MX's identity as a stable, user-friendly distro that also gives power users unusual control over core system components. CachyOS has a new January 2026 ISO release, and it continues the project's focus on performance and modern desktop features on top of Arch Linux. Now, this release brings updates across the board. It has refreshed packages and kernel options and all sorts of stuff. And one of the headline changes, though, is KDE's new Plasma Login Manager is being used, not only in the KDE edition, but also in the live ISO, because the ISO has been switched to Plasma Login Manager, as well as being switched away from X11 to Wayland now. The distro ships with multiple optimized kernels, including variants tuned for different CPUs, and continues to use aggressive compiler optimizations and performance patches. Now, that's basically the core identity of CachyOS, squeezing extra performance out of Arch without making users configure everything manually. Now, about that KDE edition, so that the new Plasma Login Manager replaces the older SDDM setup. Now, SDDM is fairly old, but also is not that well maintained. It's not like there's not a ton of features being built for it and that sort of thing. And it's not really directly built for KDE Plasma. It's just something they were using. So this was actually something we talked about on a previous episode of Twill, where KDE has been working on a new login manager, and this is now ready to go. So CachyOS is implementing it. Now, this aims for tighter integration with Plasma 6 and also a smoother login process. There are also updated desktop packages, newer Mesa and graphics stacks, and refresh tooling for installation and system management. Now, if you're into performance-focused Linux setups with minimal manual tuning, this is a really solid snapshot of where CachyOS is heading. And CachyOS is definitely a really nice option for those who want to have a rolling release system, who want to have the performance enhancement stuff, not that kind of performance enhancement, but like improved performance for the kernel and stuff like that. Anyway, CachyOS is a really good distro. If you haven't checked it out, be sure to do that. You'll find links in the show notes. As Linux users, we know what's up. Security is non-negotiable. But with threats evolving faster than ever, your security tools need to keep up without dragging your system down. Traditional agents, well, they slow you down and create stability risks. And it's time for a smarter, form security with SSH key tracking, password auditing, and drift detection, covering threats from and transforming your security strategy. Sandfly also offers free trials to show off what it can do, has to say. Sandfly is one of the most exciting pieces of security tech I've seen recently. We're excited to not only be a customer, but also offer integrated solution to our customers through DigitalOcean Marketplace. This technology addresses Linux security in a really novel and compelling way. So experience security that's effective and also gives you peace of mind. No agents, no downtime, just cutting edge. PikaOS has a new January 2026 update, and this one is a pretty big refresh across the whole stack. The project rebuilt a massive chunk of its packages, updated the kernel, refreshed desktop environments, and pushed new ISO snapshots for users who want a clean install. The latest ISO focuses heavily on package rebuilds and syncing with upstream. The distro ships with Linux 6.18 kernel, updated Mesa, and newer versions of major desktops like GNOME 49, KDE Plasma 6.5, and Budgie 10.10. PikaOS continues to ship multiple editions, including GNOME, KDE, Hyperland, and Neri, targeting gamers and power users who want modern desktops out of the box. If you're not familiar with PikaOS, well, it's built on Debian with custom compiled packages, tuned kernels, and a focus on performance and gaming. It's similar in spirit to things like Nobara and CachyOS and things like that, but with a Debian base and its own tooling layer. This update is mostly about refreshing the base and keeping everything cutting edge, not necessarily introducing a single big flagship feature, but if you count all the different updates from the various different desktops, there's a lot of new features. And if this sounds good to you, you'll find links in the show notes for PicoOS 2026 January release. I don't think they have a version number similar to like other rolling release type distributions. So that's, the latest one. Check out the latest one. Zorin OS 18 was released in October of last year, and I talked about that release on TWIL 328. But I wanted to talk about it again this week because Zorin OS just hit a pretty big milestone. Zorin has announced that they have crossed 2 million downloads. That's a strong signal of it continuing to be one of the most popular Linux distros for beginners. Zorin OS 18 introduced a revamped desktop, updated Zorin appearance layouts, and a polished onboarding experience aimed at people switching from Windows. The team also put a lot of work into performance, Flatpak integration, app compatibility, and a lot more to make it as enticing as possible for people who are switching away from Windows. Hitting 2 million downloads shows that their strategy of targeting newcomers with a polished experience is working. And it's also a reminder that beginner-friendly distros still play a big role in Linux growth. Zorin, Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and others are often the first touchpoint for people who are leaving Windows. And with the end of Windows 10, it's been a strong motivator for people switching to Linux, as well as many other things just in Windows 11 in general, giving tons of reasons for people wanting to switch. And Zorin has been there to be an option for those people, and based on the continued path Microsoft seems to committed to making their users hate being their users, Linux is likely to continue to grow among these people, and Zorin continues to be a solid option for those people wanting to switch to Linux.
I'm pausing there for a moment. This is kind of humorous, and this is regarding the Zorin version 18. It was released on October the 24th, 2025. I've been seeing for almost 2 months now content creators talking about Zorin 19. Well, they make it sound like it's going to be released anytime now in the near future. And I was just curious about it. I have looked at 18 and I was curious what 19 looked like. Well, I found out just this weekend the release cycle for Zorin is roughly about 2 years. So the Zorin 19 is not going to be released until October 2027, no matter how much they hype it and what it might ever contain and look like. I think somebody's going a little overboard, and it's not just one person, it's quite a few different people. So I thought I'd toss that in. This React OS that he's going to talk about, I remember that from more than a decade ago, and I've never gotten it to run.
OS just hit a pretty wild milestone. The project is celebrating 30 years of development, which is kind of insane for an open source operating system that's basically trying to re-implement Windows from scratch. ReactOS started in the mid-1990s as a free and open source Windows-compatible OS, inspired by the old free Win95 project. The goal has always been to recreate the Windows NT architecture so Windows drivers and applications can run natively without needing Microsoft's code. That's a massive technical challenge, and it's why ReactOS has taken decades and is still considered alpha software for the most part. But to mark this anniversary, the team published a retrospective on the project's history, challenges, and milestones, and there's been some recent technical progress too. For example, work landed on asynchronous networking connection handling, which improves how the system handles network connections and modern application behavior. ReactOS is not likely to be available for day-to-day use anytime soon, or maybe even ever due to the level of complexity it is, but it is a very important project from a research and engineering perspective, So congrats to the team, and here's to many, many more years. There's a new Linux-friendly smartphone project that's popping back up, and it's called the Next Phone, NEX phone. This is, I say that because popping back up is because it's a revival of an older concept, but now the team is pitching a convergence-focused phone that can boot Android or Linux and act like a desktop when it is docked. The idea is that you use it as a normal Android phone on the go, then plug it into a dock or an external display and boot into a full Debian environment with a desktop interface and all that. It's basically trying to be similar to Canonical's Ubuntu phone convergence, but using mainstream Android hardware with a Linux option layered on top. The Debian portion runs as an app with GPU acceleration on top of Android. And when you connect the phone to a monitor and a keyboard and mouse, well, you basically get a full Linux desktop experience with Debian. The company says the goal is to bridge mobile and desktop computing with Linux apps and a full desktop environment. There's also marketing it towards developers and Linux enthusiasts and people who want more control over their device compared to locked down Android phones. If that wasn't interesting enough for you, well, this phone can also boot into Windows 11. In fact, Next Phone has created its own custom grid-based UI for the Windows side of things. But when you connect it to a monitor, well, you can load a full Windows desktop experience for some reason if you want to. This is still very early and mostly in announcement and concept stage, but it's interesting because convergence phones keep coming back every few years. Now, whether Next Phone actually ships and delivers on the dual boot Debian experience is the big question here, but it shows there's still demand for a phone that can double as a Linux workstation in your pocket. And it's a really cool concept. Especially when Ubuntu announced it, I thought it was a really cool concept. And personally, I've wanted something like this ever since Ubuntu was trying to do this. And I still want it. But I've been waiting so long that at this point, I'd just be happy with a reliable smartphone that isn't tracking everything I do. Wouldn't that be nice? GamingOnLinux.com is reporting that there is a big milestone that was just hit for the Steam Deck. And they say that more than 25,000 games are now rated playable or verified for the Steam Deck, which is massive. Also, the rate of which these games are being verified is increasing more and more. So, it took 7 months to go from November 2024 to June 2025, and in that period, it went from 17,000 to 20,000, so a jump of 3,000 games in those 7 months. And now we went 6 months, and there's now 5,000 more games. So that means the pace has almost doubled in the last 6 months. This info comes from Valve's Deck Verified program, where games get tested and tagged as verified, playable, unsupported, or unknown. And verified means that it should just work out of the box, like right out of the box on the Steam Deck. And playable means, well, it runs, but it might need some tweaks like manual graphics settings and maybe a keyboard for certain inputs and that sort of thing. And hitting 25,000 compatible titles shows how far Proton and Linux gaming just has come. A few years ago, the idea of tens of thousands of Windows games working on Linux handheld hardware or working on Linux in general would have sounded ridiculous. Like if you go back before Proton, the amount of games we had was significant. We had a good amount of games, but it wasn't anything like it when Proton came out. Now it's basically normal for Steam Deck owners to just have tons of games available to them. In fact, when I first got started with Linux, I don't think there was even 25 games to play. It was a very long time ago, but still, Steam coming to Linux changed everything, and Proton also changed everything. It also shows how serious Valve is about treating the Steam Deck like a mainstream platform. Developers are targeting it, Valve keeps improving Proton, and the compatibility list just keeps growing. At this point, the Steam Deck is one of the strongest proof points that Linux gaming can scale to a mass market audience. And it's just awesome to hear this. And well done, Valve. Thank you, Valve, for making Linux gaming a thing. So for those who don't know, before Valve, the 25 games might be a little bit of an exaggeration. I don't know how many there really were, but it wasn't a lot. It was less than 100, I would bet. Then Steam is announced for Linux, and a lot of games are compatible. They had to be made native, so you still had the limitations of what games were available, but you had an option, and that was fantastic. And then 2018 comes around, and they announce Proton, changes everything. Now, so there are some pros and cons to Proton. Like one of the cons is that native gaming on Linux is actually more performant than through Proton, just because of not having to like translate the Windows tools and Windows layer stuff. But at the same time, it increased the amount of possibilities that games could work on Linux. So it's just fantastic. And now having 25,000 games verified for the Steam Deck, which means, practically speaking, that 25,000 games are verified for Linux in general too. That's not always the case. Some games are made for Steam Deck that don't work on Linux, and that it does happen. But the vast majority of them do work on Linux. And I'm pretty sure Valve even has a requirement that you kind of have to do that now. That could be wrong. I could be wrong about that one. I don't remember. I remember hearing people talk about that, but I don't remember if it actually happened. So we'll just put that on like an asterisk. Someone let me know in the comments if that did happen, because I don't remember. I've covered a lot of news on this show for many years, and I could just be misremembering. Anyway, let me know in the comments.
Okay, now I have to give you a piece of information I more recently came across. A lot of people like using Ubuntu right off the bat as a first Linux distro. And there's a funny thing about that. Because it's made by a large corporation, Canonical, they test out things on a lot of different hardware and have driver support for that hardware. So any other fork of Ubuntu into other distros, like Linux Mint, like KDE Plasma, as two examples, which are what everybody here is using, you get the benefit of all the drivers. This also explains some of the reason why some people who try out LMDE, Linux Mint Debian Edition, it doesn't have all the drivers that the regular Mint has from Ubuntu. In a parallel, those who use Fedora, I'm playing a little bit when I get a chance with Fedora 43. That's a large corporation called IBM that owns Red Hat. And Red Hat uses Fedora as the test bed before moving code into the Red Hat Enterprise version. Well, they also have pretty good driver support in Fedora. So if anybody makes a fork of Fedora for a new distro, would probably get the benefit of drivers for that. Any that are not based as a fork of Fedora, and I think OpenSUSE is one of them, it does not have all the same driver support capability. And Arch has none of these driver update capabilities. They have to create the drivers on their own, by and large. But still, you can get a lot of mileage out of most any Linux distro. You just have certain ones that you'll get even better performance and more hardware that works versus doesn't work for a given distro. So that's something I came across within the last month. So I thought I'd throw that out. Now, in addition, the first article was about Wine. Wine has had a major update, and they brought up in this here also about Proton, and there's also Lutris. These work in conjunction with Wine, and these projects are pushing forward for supporting games on Linux. And in doing so, they are finding the problems that Wine cannot handle, finding some solutions, and pushing these up to the Wine developers. And they're looking at this stuff very interestingly and conservatively. And eventually, a lot of that code is going to be native in Wine. Wine, I also have another article in here, and God only knows which one it is. Okay, this might be the one. Not sure about that. There's Affinity was a studio tool that's on Windows. It's the third tier. You got a Photoshop. I forget what the second tier was. And a third tier is Affinity Studio for a lot of developers and professionals. And they were bought out by Canva, which is in the process of trying to make Affinity also work on Linux, like Canva works on Linux right now. So that's something coming down the pike. Everyone's trying that, and okay, I'm not finding the one I'm looking for. Anyway, there's an article in my handout that talks about properly installing Wine. He found out the hard way what you have to do to properly install Wine and have the greatest success. If you think you know what you're doing and you just haphazardly install Wine, you may end up with old modules, etc., that cause problems in your setup. And one of the recent things that the current version of Wine 11 has is support for the WoW side-by-side x64 library functions. And in this other article, it has information to get the configuration, how to install it from the Wine headquarters. And it gives you very good advice. One of the things that a lot of people skip is giving Wine the 32-bit support, which there is still a lot of Windows software made on the Systems 32 compiler instead of the System 64 compilers. So basically, if you install it correctly, you will get much more Windows software to run through the Windows Wine emulator. It's not even an emulator. That's an incorrect term. It's a way of interpreting Microsoft's executable code to POSIX code to run in the Linux operating system and do the same basic thing. So that's a big change. Okay.
Imagine waking up one morning in 2025 and realizing that one of the biggest technology shifts in modern American history is happening almost quietly, without flashy launch events or Super Bowl ads. Across government offices, military departments, public schools, universities, research labs, and even parts of the private sector, Windows systems are being phased out and replaced with Linux-based operating systems. This isn't science fiction, and it isn't some niche experiment run by a few tech enthusiasts. This is a real, measurable trend that has been building for years, and in 2025 it has reached a tipping point. The United States, a country that for decades was synonymous with Microsoft Windows dominance, is increasingly turning its back on Windows and embracing Linux instead. To many people, this sounds shocking, almost unbelievable, but when you look at the data, the policies, the economics, and the security realities of the modern world, the reasons become very clear. For decades, Windows was the default choice for American institutions. It was familiar, it had strong vendor support, and it worked with the vast ecosystem of proprietary software that businesses relied on. Governments standardized on it, schools taught it, and corporations built their workflows around it. But over time, cracks began to show. Licensing costs kept rising, forced upgrade cycles disrupted workflows, and the closed nature of Windows became a growing liability in an era where transparency, security, and digital sovereignty matter more than ever. By the early 2020s, Linux had already taken over servers, cloud infrastructure, supercomputers, and embedded systems. But desktops and workstations were still considered Windows territory. That assumption is now being challenged in a big way. One of the biggest drivers behind this shift is cost, and the numbers are eye-opening. According to internal audits and publicly available procurement data from U.S. state governments and federal agencies, Windows licensing and associated enterprise software costs run into billions of dollars annually. When you factor in upgrade requirements, extended support contracts, and hardware refresh cycles tied to new Windows versions, the financial burden becomes massive. Linux, on the other hand, offers a fundamentally different model. The operating system itself is free, and while enterprise support from vendors like Red Hat, Canonical, or SUSE does cost money, those costs are predictable, negotiable, and significantly lower over the long term. In several state-level pilot programs, switching desktop systems to Linux-based distributions resulted in savings of 30 to 60% over a 5-year period. When scaled nationally, that translates into billions of dollars saved, money that can be redirected toward infrastructure, education, healthcare, or cybersecurity. Security is another major reason the US is moving away from Windows. Over the past decade, Windows has been the primary target for malware, ransomware, and large-scale cyber attacks. This isn't because Windows is inherently bad, but because its massive market share makes it the most attractive target. In 2023 and 2024 alone, ransomware attacks on U.S. hospitals, city governments, and school districts caused billions of dollars in damage and disrupted essential services. Many of these attacks exploited Windows-specific vulnerabilities, legacy systems, or poorly patched environments. Linux, while not immune to security issues, offers several advantages. Its permission model, package management systems, and rapid patching culture make it harder for malware to spread unchecked. More importantly, the open-source nature of Linux allows security agencies and independent researchers to audit the code directly. For government systems handling sensitive data, this level of transparency is no longer a luxury. It's a requirement. There is also the issue of trust. In an age of geopolitical tension, supply chain attacks, and digital espionage, relying heavily on closed-source software from a single vendor poses strategic risks. U.S. policymakers have become increasingly vocal about the need for technological independence and resilience. Linux aligns perfectly with this goal. It is not controlled by any single company or country. Its development is distributed across thousands of contributors worldwide, including American universities, corporations, and government-funded research institutions. By adopting Linux, U.S. agencies reduce their dependence on proprietary black boxes and gain more control over their own digital infrastructure. This shift isn't anti-Microsoft. It's pro-sovereignty and pro-transparency. Education is another area where the Linux transition is accelerating. Public schools and universities across the United States are under constant budget pressure, yet they are expected to teach students modern, relevant skills. Linux has become the backbone of computer science, data science, artificial intelligence, and cloud computing. Teaching students on Linux systems better prepares them for real-world technology careers. Several large school districts have already reported significant savings after switching computer labs to Linux, while also seeing improved performance on older hardware. Instead of buying new PCs just to meet Windows system requirements, schools can extend the life of existing machines by installing lightweight Linux distributions. In 2025, with Windows hardware requirements continuing to rise, this factor alone is pushing many educational institutions to abandon Windows entirely. Then there's the cloud factor. Almost every major US tech company, from Amazon to Google to Meta, runs its infrastructure primarily on Linux. Government agencies increasingly rely on cloud services for scalability and efficiency. Running Linux on desktops and workstations creates a more consistent environment between local systems and cloud servers. Developers, system administrators, and researchers benefit from using the same tools and workflows everywhere. This consistency reduces training costs, minimizes errors, and improves productivity. In contrast, Windows often requires additional compatibility layers, virtualization, or proprietary tools to integrate smoothly with Linux-based cloud infrastructure. Another overlooked but crucial point is performance and stability. Linux systems are known for their ability to run for months or even years without requiring a reboot. Updates can often be applied without disrupting users, and system resources are used more efficiently. In government and enterprise environments where downtime equals lost productivity and lost money, this matters a lot. Windows updates, while improved compared to the past, are still notorious for unexpected reboots, long installation times, and occasional update-related failures. When thousands of systems are involved, even small inefficiencies add up quickly. The statistics from 2025 paint a clear picture. Internal reports and independent surveys indicate that over 40% of newly deployed government workstations in the US are now running some form of Linux or Linux-based operating system. In certain departments focused on research, defense, and cybersecurity, that number exceeds 60%. At the state level, several states have announced plans to transition the majority of their administrative desktops to Linux within the next 3 to 5 years. In higher education, Linux adoption on campus-managed systems has crossed the 50% mark in many technical universities. Even in the private sector, especially among startups and mid-sized companies, Linux desktops are becoming increasingly common. It's also important to address the myth that Linux is too difficult for average users. This may have been true 15 or 20 years ago, but modern Linux distributions are polished, user-friendly, and highly customizable. Desktop environments like GNOME, KDE Plasma, and Cinnamon offer intuitive interfaces that require minimal training. Office productivity is handled by mature software like LibreOffice, which is more than capable of meeting the needs of most users. Web-based applications have further reduced the importance of operating system-specific software. In 2025, the browser is the primary workspace for many jobs, and Linux runs all major browsers, just as well as Windows, often better. Microsoft's own strategy has also played a role in this shift. Over the past few years, Microsoft has increasingly focused on cloud services, subscriptions, and cross-platform tools. Windows is no longer the company's sole or even primary focus. This has left some enterprise and government customers feeling that their needs are secondary to consumer features and cloud integration. Forced online accounts, telemetry concerns, and tighter hardware restrictions have further alienated institutional users. Ironically, Microsoft itself is one of the largest contributors to the Linux ecosystem, using Linux extensively in Azure and supporting open-source projects. This reality makes it easier for organizations to justify moving away from Windows without feeling like they are abandoning industry standards. Another major factor is longevity and control. With Windows, users are tied to Microsoft's release schedule and support timelines. When support ends, systems must be upgraded or replaced, regardless of whether they still meet the organization's needs. Linux offers long-term support versions that can be maintained for a decade or more, either through community support or paid enterprise contracts. Organizations can choose when and how to upgrade rather than being forced into disruptive transitions. This flexibility is especially valuable in government and critical infrastructure environments where stability is paramount. There's also a cultural shift happening within IT departments. Younger system administrators and developers are far more comfortable with Linux than previous generations. Many grew up using Linux in school, on servers, or in cloud environments. For them, Linux is not an alternative, it's the default. As these professionals move into decision-making roles, they naturally advocate for systems they know, trust, and can control. This generational change is quietly reshaping technology choices across the country. Critics often argue that Linux lacks support for certain proprietary software, especially in areas like specialized engineering tools or legacy applications. While this is still true in some cases, the gap is narrowing rapidly. Many software vendors now offer native Linux versions, driven by demand from enterprise and cloud customers. For applications that remain Windows only, virtualization and compatibility layers provide workable solutions. Importantly, organizations are increasingly questioning whether they should remain locked into proprietary tools at all, or whether open standards and open source alternatives make more sense in the long run. When you combine all these factors, cost savings, security, transparency, performance, educational alignment, cloud integration, and strategic independence, the move away from Windows starts to look less like a rebellion and more like a rational evolution. The United States isn't abandoning Windows overnight, and Windows isn't disappearing. It will continue to exist, especially in consumer markets and certain specialized enterprise roles. But its era as the unquestioned default operating system for American institutions is clearly ending. In 2025, Linux is no longer just the operating system of hackers, servers, or enthusiasts. It is a mainstream, trusted, and strategically important platform. The statistics reveal a quiet revolution, one driven not by hype, but by hard numbers and real-world experience. As more agencies, schools, and companies share their success stories, the momentum continues to build. What once seemed shocking is now simply the new normal. The USA isn't just experimenting with Linux anymore, it's embracing it as a core part of its digital future, and that decision is reshaping the technology landscape in ways that will be felt for decades to come. Imagine waking up one morning in 2025 and realize
Any questions, comments? Okay.
Linux storage can look intimidating from the outside, but inside it follows a very clean and logical structure. Once you understand how partitions work, how file systems store your data, and how Linux ties everything together inside one directory tree, you'll see the system in a completely different way. This narration is going to take you through all of that, step by step. Let's begin by breaking down the foundation: partitions. A partition is simply a section of your storage drive. Imagine you have a large, empty piece of land. You could build one giant house on it, or you could divide it into multiple plots and build separate units. A storage drive works the same way. You can create one giant partition for everything, but most operating systems prefer splitting the drive into multiple logical areas. Linux relies heavily on this idea, and every partition has its own purpose. The most important one is the root partition. It's represented by a single slash. You can think of it as the main building where the entire operating system lives. Every file, every configuration, every program starts here. If this partition is missing or damaged, your Linux system cannot run, because the root directory is the anchor for everything else. Then comes the home partition. This is your personal space. This is where all your user data goes. Your documents, pictures, downloads, videos, game libraries, browser data, desktop layouts, configuration files, everything that defines your personal experience in Linux lives inside your home directory. The beautiful thing about having a separate home partition is that if you ever reinstall Linux or switch to another distro, you can keep your personal data intact just by mounting the same home partition again. The next important partition is swap. Swap acts like a safety net for your RAM. If your system needs more memory than what's physically installed, swap steps in to help. It's slower than RAM, but it prevents your system from crashing when memory gets tight. On laptops, swap is also used to save the system state when entering hibernation. Without enough swap space, hibernation simply won't work. Swap can be a dedicated partition, or it can be a swap file inside the root partition. Then there's the boot partition. This is a small but crucial area where Linux stores the kernel, the initial RAM disk, and the bootloader. Some Linux distributions automatically create it, while others place the boot files directly inside the root partition. But when it exists, it plays a major role in starting the system. Finally, we have the EFI system partition. This only exists on modern UEFI systems, and it's shared between operating systems. It contains the bootloaders for Linux, Windows, and any other OS you may install. Without the EFI partition, the system simply wouldn't know what to load when you press the power button. Now that we've covered partitions, let's move to the next layer, file systems. A file system is the structure used to organize files inside a partition. You can think of it as the method that defines how data is stored, how it's indexed, how fast it can be accessed, and how it handles corruption or errors. Different file systems have different strengths. ext4 is the classic and most widely used option in Linux. It's extremely stable, fast, and well tested. It handles everyday use effortlessly and has been the default file system for many years. For most desktop users, ext4 is perfectly reliable and gets the job done without complication. BTRFS is more advanced. It brings features that make it feel like a modern storage system. For example, it supports snapshots. A snapshot is a frozen copy of your file system at a specific moment in time. If something goes wrong, maybe a bad update or a misconfiguration, you can roll back to the snapshot instantly. It also supports compression, self-healing capabilities, and subvolumes, which allow you to organize data more flexibly. Some distributions, like Fedora and OpenSUSE, use BTRFS by default because of these powerful features. XFS is designed for performance, especially with large files. It excels in server environments or systems that deal with media editing, virtual machines, or large databases. While it can be used on desktops, its strengths really shine in enterprise workloads. ext4 is built specifically for flash storage, like SSDs and eMMC drives. It's lightweight, fast, and optimized for devices where flash memory is the primary storage technology. It's especially useful on Chromebooks, SBCs, or budget laptops with eMMC storage. ZFS is one of the most advanced file systems ever created. It combines file system features with volume management, offering incredible data integrity and protection. It handles snapshots, replication, compression, and more. However, it requires more RAM and is typically used in environments like NAS systems, home servers, and enterprise setups. While you can use ZFS on Linux, it isn't always available out of the box due to licensing differences. Now let's connect these ideas to the Linux directory tree. Unlike Windows, Linux doesn't label drives with letters like C or D. Everything starts from a single root directory, just a /. From that root, all other folders branch out, directories like bin, etc, home, user, and var. What's unique in Linux is how storage is mounted. A mount simply means linking a partition to a specific directory in the tree. For example, if you have a separate home partition, Linux mounts that partition to the home directory. If you have a separate boot partition, it gets mounted to the boot directory, and so on. This method keeps the entire system unified under one tree, even if the data physically sits on separate partitions. When you install Linux, a very common partition structure looks like this. You'll typically see an EFI system partition formatted as FAT32, then a root partition, usually formatted as ext4 or BTRFS, a separate home partition for your data, and a swap partition sized based on your RAM. This arrangement is simple, efficient, and easy to maintain. Now, if you're dual booting with Windows, you'll have even more partitions. Windows creates its own system partition and a recovery partition. Both Windows and Linux share the EFI partition, which stores the bootloaders for each operating system. Linux adds its own root, home, and swap partitions without disturbing Windows. As long as the installer is used correctly, both operating systems can live on the same drive without conflict. Understanding partitions also helps when things go wrong. If your system refuses to boot, the issue might be with the EFI partition or the bootloader. If you're running out of space, the root partition might be too small. If your system becomes sluggish during heavy workloads, swap might be filling up, indicating the need for more RAM. Knowing where your partitions are and how they're mounted gives you a clear path to diagnosing the problem. Choosing the right file system also depends on your habits. If you want simplicity and stability, ext4 is the best choice. If you want advanced features like snapshots or compression, BTRFS is ideal. If your work involves large files, XFS delivers strong performance. If you're on a device using flash memory, F2FS gives better efficiency. For enterprise-level data protection and long-term reliability, ZFS is unmatched. As we wrap this up, keep in mind that Linux partitions and file systems aren't just technical details. They're the backbone of how Linux runs. They determine how data is stored, how fast the system performs, how safe your files are, and how easy it is to recover from mistakes. Once you understand these pieces, everything else in Linux, installations, upgrades, dual booting, and troubleshooting, becomes far simpler. If you found this guide helpful, consider subscribing to Tech Solution Z for more in-depth Linux tutorials. This is Yasser, signing off.
Any questions, comments? I threw this one in because of the fact that I know some people that are still using the Easter egg and refuse to even listen to why it might be better to have some of this stuff broken out into separate partitions, like the home partition or a var partition. And you can't change their mind on it. It's mostly a case of ignorance. And the quickest, easiest way to get the system set up, donate the drive to Just Linux and do a simple install. That's it. You're done. Good luck if you run into trouble. All right. It's already been 2 hours, so offhand, I'm not going to go any further on this. I'll get into doing the handout. All right, now, what? Hang on. Okay. Now, let's see if I can figure out how to make magic. Come on. What the heck is going on? Okay, files out there on the chat, so you can go ahead and download it.
I'm good.
Everybody got their copy?
Got it.
Okay. How about you, Dennis? All right. Peter?
Yes.
Okay. Just making sure. All
Thank
right.
you for doing that.
All right. I'm not sure all of what's going to come up net for the next month. I do know I have I don't I one of these upcoming months I may have to substitute for Sanford in a meeting, which means I'll have three meetings in a given month. So that's something else. But I keep coming across tons and tons of articles and that, and I review them, and I do post to that Discord space, and seems to be an awful lot going on. There's even a in the works NTFS3 driver that's in one of the articles. And exactly when it'll be available, I don't know, but it increases the reliability and usefulness of the driver, so that if you have to interface to a Windows operating system, such as in a dual boot situation, you may not have to mess with a FAT exe file structure or FAT32 structure. You might be able to just use a separate NTFS partition and have both Windows and the Linux use the same one. But I guess under the current version of the NTFS driver, it's not as useful and reliable. So we'll have to see.
Well, NTFS 3G and NTFS 3 have produced a few interesting issues for me, but I can still share an NTFS partition between Windows and Linux, whether it's Mint, LMDE. I've also done it with Fedora, and I've also done it with Ubuntu. So, even though there are sometimes some issues, it does seem to work pretty well, except if there's some kind of an update that causes a regression. The new one is called NTFS Plus.
Well, they only refer to it as NTFS 3 in the article.
Well, it's actually not NTFS 3, it's NTFS Plus. And it's an improvement, and it should be coming pretty soon.
Okay. Well, I'm going to be looking into the wine. Also, there's an article in there about workspaces, desktops, and so you might find that of interest as well. Quite a few different news type articles. Several were added today between after breakfast up till about 4 o'clock this afternoon.
Oh, by the way, NTFS Plus was just recently renamed just NTFS. So now it's the NTFS driver.
Well, like I say, it's at least they're making headway on some improvements that make Windows and Linux a little more compatible in data structure. So there are still a lot of people that in the past that they had to create FAT32 FAT extended in order to do data transfer between the two OSs. And now there may be fewer reasons to do that type of partition and just use an NTFS partition and get the job done probably more efficiently. Anybody got any final words?
No. I see a rainbow.
Well, that's good. Give us all tickets. We'll come out and see it with you.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Somewhere on this island, you can almost see a rainbow every day. It's just a matter of how far you want to drive. But this was out my window, so.
Well, we don't have any rainbows right here because it just finished snowing.
Yeah, I don't remember if I ever remember seeing a rainbow in the wintertime.
They actually do happen, but they're very uncommon. Rain is much better at making them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because raindrops are round, whereas snowflakes aren't. But in any event, we've got piles that are like over my head now.
That's good.
And that's not just where they plowed. That's drifts. Oh, no, drifts up to about my chest.
Well,
I can remember those.
Parts of Northwest Indiana, east of me, have had some pretty good snowfalls as well.
Yeah.
Because of lake effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're getting that in upstate New York.
We've only had, I'll call it 3 major snowfalls this season, going back to really before winter started in December, going back into November. And it's not unusual to have cold weather in November close to Thanksgiving. This was well before Thanksgiving with the first major snowfall. But
Yep.
at least so far, it's not been insurmountable.
We've had two. They weren't exactly back to back, but two big snowfalls, and they were since New Year's.
Yeah, but at least it's more winter-like weather than the prior 3 winters we had in my location, which were very mild, relatively speaking.
Yep.
I wish it would stay that way in a certain sense. But at the same time, too, it comes having those warm winters also cause problems of drought conditions and excessive amount of bugs in the summertime, etc.
Yeah. It's not good for our native plants either.
Well, I'm sure of that too, but at least it's a case where we have a more normal winter this year.
Yeah.
With luck, we'll have a more normal summer, which means I might be able to get out this summer, and I couldn't last summer.
Yeah. We'll see whether it turns out to be normal.
Well, only time will tell.
Yep. So,
All right. Well, we'll give it a quit for the day. Let's see. Not this coming Thursday, but a week from this coming Thursday
Right.
should be keeping up with tech with Sanford.
yeah, okay.
All right.